Now, the Earth is roughly 4.6 billion years old, and life formed around 3.5 billion years ago. So where did life come from? Well, there is some debate on that, and there's some evidence supporting different ideas, and we'll talk a bit about that in another chapter. But the term for life beginning is called biogenesis, or you may hear it called abiogenesis, which is life coming from non-life. So going from chemistry to living things. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. So I'm not going to hit that very hard today, but I do want you to know around 3.5 billion years ago. What I recommend you do is you print off a geologic time scale, and you just write down when some of these major events take place, so you can kind of put them into context and you know when they occurred. For example, of course, life originating starts in the Precambrian, right? So I'm not going to cover a lot of topics today, but I do want to talk about a few of the major events of life from a global perspective and from an Arkansas perspective. So the Earth forms around 4.6 billion years ago. Life shows up. The first prokaryotes that we have evidence for are around 3.5 billion years ago, like I said. So we think the first life on Earth was a form of prokaryote, so some kind of simple cell that could replicate and metabolize energy. And it's not until quite a bit later, 1.8 billion years ago, that we have evidence for the first eukaryotes. And remember, fossils don't preserve all that well, so it's amazing we have that evidence to begin with. But I have this image here. These are called stromatolites. These are kind of like coral reefs. These are like rocks that these bacteria deposit. Layer after layer after layer, and the bacteria live on the outer surface of these things. And we have fossils of those even here in Arkansas. And some of those fossils in parts of the world go back to the Precambrian. That's how we know that these bacteria were alive back then. Even though we don't have fossils of the bacteria, we have fossils of the structures that they made. And then if we look here, we have complex multicellular organisms. So we have eukaryotes 1.8 billion years ago. Then right towards the end of the Precambrian, we have multicellular organisms showing up. So multicellularity evolves. And I want to talk a little bit about this, and we'll hit it more in the chapter on eukaryotes. But all cells originally were prokaryotes, right? They did not have a nucleus. They did not have membrane-bound organelles. So where did organelles like the nucleus come from? Well, it appears that those bacteria came from a process shown here known as endosymbiosis, which is when one organism kind of moves into another organism. And like I said, we'll talk about it in a future chapter here. But endosymbiosis is when one organism moves into another. So in this case, for example, in this example, we're going to focus on mitochondria, let's say, and chloroplasts. One organism, which is a bacterium essentially that can metabolize energy and make ATP, moves into this cell and it becomes an organelle over time. The same thing for chloroplasts. So a lot of our organelles appear to have originally stemmed from one cell being engulfed by another and then becoming a part of that cell over time. And that's why mitochondria, for example, have DNA that's a lot like a bacterium even today. So like I said, we'll hit that more later, but this is what's happening in the Precambrian, allowing the rise of the eukaryotes, this process of endosymbiosis. During the Precambrian here in Arkansas, there was a lot of volcanic activity to the north. Everything was underwater, by the way, under ocean. But we have the Ozark Dome being pushed upward by volcanic activity beneath. So this is what forms the Ozark Mountains eventually. It's a lot of magma pushing upwards from deep within the earth, pushing that land further up into the sky. So that forms during the Precambrian. As we cross into the Paleozoic, we have the Cambrian explosion. By the end of the Cambrian explosion, all animal phyla that we have today are present. So by phyla, I mean chordates, arthropods, things like that. All of those phyla are present. And there's also a lot of phyla that are no longer here, that are now extinct, that were around at this time. And we have the major animal body plan. So, there's a head at one end and a anus at the other end. That sort of body plan exists by the end of the Cambrian explosion. But what we see here is a massive... it looks like a massive explosion of diversity in the fossil record, and it's because lots of things were evolving very rapidly. Predators were evolving to eat prey, and prey were evolving ways to fight predators, and that caused them to evolve a lot of hard parts, which fossilize very easily and allow them to show up pretty well in the fossil record. So if we look at this graph, or this image down here, we have prokaryotes showing up in the Precambrian. Towards the end of the Precambrian, we have eukaryotes showing up, multicellularity evolving, and right towards the very end of the Precambrian, right as we cross into the Paleozoic, animals show up. And so animals are around during the Cambrian explosion. So here we can see a timeline, we can see the Paleozoic, and we can see estimated times when these different groups of animals, these modern phyla of animals, evolved. A lot of them show up in the Precambrian or just after the Cambrian, during the Cambrian explosion. Meanwhile, during the Paleozoic, a lot of the continents collide with each other. So we have this thing known as continental drift, which you can read about in your textbook. The tectonic plates move thanks to the movement of magma and things on the Earth pushing those plates around, and the continents collide. And during this collision, you can see these dark brown areas that says mountains. This was happening, Arkansas is somewhere around here. So what happens is South America and Africa and North America crash into each other, and that squishes a lot of the rocks together. And so, like I said earlier, we have the Ozark Mountains in northern Arkansas. And then as we move south, we have all these folded up rocks that formed when South America and Africa crashed into North America. And that formed the Ouachita Mountains. And those formed then during the Paleozoic era. And what I want you to see here is during the Paleozoic era, we have this huge continent forming. This is really important for the future of the evolution of life. This huge single continent forms, okay? And that single continent is known as Pangea, P-A-N-G-E-A, Pangea. And Pangea forms, and during this time we have a lot of life crawling out of the water onto land during the Paleozoic. We have the colonization of land. Early in the Paleozoic, fish evolve, and then some of those fish evolve into amphibians as the Paleozoic continues. From those amphibians, we have reptiles evolving. We also have insects invading the land, and we have plants evolving on land during this time as well. So during the Paleozoic is when we really invade the land. Plants evolve during this time, terrestrial plants. Insects crawl out of the water, and then later amphibians come out of the water, and so things are invading the land during this time called the Paleozoic. So the last part of the Paleozoic is known as the Permian, and during this time Arkansas was above water, so we're not going to have many rocks from this time because Arkansas was not having rocks deposited then. But we also have, during this time, the reason I want to mention the Permian, and I want you to know it, is because at the end of the Permian, which marks the end of the Paleozoic, we have the biggest extinction of life known on the planet. So we had all these cool critters like Dimetrodon you see down here, and all these big conifers and lycopod trees, these big fern-like plants here. We had lots of critters on land, but by the end of the Paleozoic, 96% of aquatic life, including marine life, is extinct, and 70% of life on land is extinct. And that may have been due to a lot of volcano activity changing the climate rapidly during the end of the Paleozoic. And there may have been some impacts from asteroids too. I'm not sure exactly what caused the Permian extinction, but we can look into it as the semester goes. So after we leave the Paleozoic, we're going to cross into the Mesozoic. But I want to show you this image here. So here's the Paleozoic. This is Pangea, that single global continent, which is really dry in the middle and probably wet around the edges, which helps to encourage life to evolve to adapt to drier and drier habitats. Then as we cross into the Mesozoic, the plates begin to break up again, and the Earth begins to look more and more and more like the present Earth as those continents drift around. And of course, you can look at the fossils on these continents and the distribution of animals that have evolved on these continents and make sense of that based on your knowledge of where the plates were in the past. Okay, so the Mesozoic comes around. The Mesozoic is the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. This is the age of the dinosaurs. This is when flowering plants evolve. Southern Arkansas is underwater during this time, which is why we have dinosaur footprints down here in this part of the state. A lot of the middle of North America is underwater during this time. And at the end of the Cretaceous is when dinosaurs go extinct. So mammals show up in the fossil record during the Jurassic. Flowering plants show up during the Cretaceous, and dinosaurs go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is the end of the Mesozoic era. So I'm going to pick up from there in the next video, and we'll talk about the evolution of mammals just a little bit, and we'll bring ourselves up to the modern era.